This is episode 419 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Well, Wally, I talk a little bit about it later on in the show, but freshly back from a road trip vacation with the whole family, which in some circles would indicate that I need a vacation from my vacation. It was overall a very pleasant trip, though, and I am happy to be back with you, and we'll talk a little bit about some details from the trip, specifically, being out on the road and the gas price situation, etc. But while I was out of town, the gross haven't done this in a while. The GDP data for the first quarter of 2022 at the state level came out, and this is the first quarter where the federal government saw a shrinkage in the overall U.S. economy. So this is January through March of 2022, and it lags more considerably than a lot of their other data because state-by-state data takes a lot longer to compile and analyze for those folks at the Bureau of Economic Analysis. You can find this post at airsofenchantment.com. So this is relevant because, of course, GDP measures the overall productivity of our economy. A lot of folks are expecting the U.S. economy to go into a recession based on the first quarter, and then the second quarter U.S. overall data have to come out, and we'll know whether we're in a recession.
And that is the definition of a recession, is 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. And Paul, I don't know the answer to this question. You don't either. And it doesn't matter in the short term as much. Is that real or nominal growth? Because we have so much inflation. I noticed that, it's like the difference between, quote, real dollars and nominal dollars is getting to be really big right now. So,
yeah, and I'm not completely sure how they compile that. But the U.S. overall economy shrank by 1.69% during the first quarter of 2022. Now, the state-level data that came out recently at the end of June show that, obviously, anytime you have 50 states with 50 different economic policy regimes, economies, all kinds of different details, they shrink at different rates. New Mexico, in our shrinkage, if you will, vastly outpaced the federal government, declining by 4.7%. Neighboring states like Colorado, 1.9% reduction, 2.0% in Utah, 2.5% in Arizona, 2.3% in Texas. So, New Mexico not looking so good in the first quarter. And, I think there's a lot of questions. In fact, I would say this data in some ways opens up more questions than answers. Is this the new economic normal? And does that mean that New Mexico, which normally lags in a growing economic situation, is now going to be leading the charge in terms of kind of a declining economic picture, and whether we are in fact heading into a recession? These are other questions that we don't have the answers to, Wally.
Yeah, and there are many questions. And Paul, I looked at that report, and it's very high level, and there's not lots and lots of detail on a state basis. But yes, I recall that definitions are important, in being such a large energy state as New Mexico is. I believe for the gross state product, they kind of do the economic value add sort of thing, as the amount of credit that the state gets for its gross state product, or the state share of GDP. But in any event, the fact that energy is humming along right now, and so that's a big industry of the state, but everything else combined obviously isn't, or that number wouldn't be negative.
Yeah, and I don't know when the federal data come out for the second quarter. Of course, that quarter ended on June 30th. I know that Wall Street these days is looking very closely at those kinds of data, so it's important stuff. But from the New Mexico perspective, we obviously struggled throughout the pandemic. We still have the highest unemployment rate. Revenues are plentiful due to the oil and gas industry, but amazingly, that hasn't really filtered down into the state's GDP numbers. So, a few states did see some positive growth. Vermont, New Hampshire saw tiny rates of growth in that quarter. Massachusetts, New Mexico, of course, our governor ended the state's mask mandate February 17th, a day which will live in not infamy, but actually some level of excitement in my book, because that's when the mask mandate ended. That was the last of the really tangible things that people were dealing with in the state. So, halfway, almost exactly through the relevant quarter that we're talking about. A few states saw even more significant declines in the first quarter: Wyoming, North Dakota, Alaska, and West Virginia. But the list is pretty short, and we'll see where this all goes. The economy, though, nationally and hopefully, I think at the state level, is very high on voters' priorities. It's something that very, very relevant, very important, and we're all watching these data very closely.
Yeah, the two things. One that's there right now in real terms, it's impacting every aspect of the economy, and that is inflation is a big concern, and in terms of how bad for how long. The other one is a concern, but we've not seen the best performance in the stock market, but potentially there's a long way down that could go as well, and those two things both impact what shall we say, the mood of the electorate and the health of the economy, and both of those are looking a little bit challenging right now for sure. And with regard to Vermont and New Hampshire, what's the saying? As Vermont and New Hampshire goes, so goes the United States, said no one ever. It's like, as we look at the big states, Texas down 2.3, California down 1, New York 1.3, Illinois 2.5, all over the place. And it is interesting, notwithstanding the fact that there's a lot of stories of people leaving California, they're doing pretty well from a percentage gross state product, their share of the GDP across the country.
Well, and I only take one issue with your remarks, and that is only in presidential elections.
And you know what? I meant that economically, yes, not politically. So very good clarification. Yes, New Hampshire is very important because it's one of the early states that we get an indication.
The free state, of course.
Oh, yes.
No income tax and no sales tax. God bless New Hampshire. And if they can do that with, I don't know if zero oil and gas, but pretty close to
you
zero.
know what? If there's oil and gas, they're probably scraping it off the roads because it leaked out of an old car. So
yeah. So when it comes to economic growth and issues holding us back, we bang the drum regularly on this podcast on behalf of reform for the gross receipts tax in New Mexico. And I hate to read too much from one article, but Dan McKay, Albuquerque Journal, July 5th, as sales tax drops in New Mexico, hard choices await. Now, while you and I especially have a more personal experience with the GRT, but some of the quotes from folks in this hearing that took place recently really give me some degree of hope that there's at least an understanding of the problem. But I'll specifically bring up an analyst from the legislature. His name is, I'm not seeing in this article, but of course on July 1st, we did see the reduction of the GRT by 0.125. That's all well and good, but it's not going to get us to the promised land in terms of the need for real reform of the gross receipts tax. And Ismael Torres, chief economist for the Legislative Finance Committee, gets it, at least as written in the Albuquerque Journal. He said, and I quote, "The complexity of the gross receipts tax system, the high rate, and the taxation on business-to-business transactions contribute to New Mexico's poor situation with regard to the GRT. Obviously, that last part is ad-libbed a bit, but it's basically a direct quote from the newspaper article quoting Ishmael Torres, chief economist for the LFC. The real anchor, he continues, for New Mexico's taxes tend to be the gross receipts tax. It's regressive, hitting lower income families harder than others because they spend a higher rate of their income on consumption. And then finally, giving some level of credit where credit is due to Representative Mo Maestas. He, when you talk about the issue of the swap that happens many moons ago during the reign of one Bill Richardson, where the grocery tax was eliminated, you still pay tax. So saying it's the food tax is not correct. It's the grocery tax. If you go out to eat, you're paying gross receipts tax. So, and plenty of poor people, plenty of people at all levels go out to eat on a very regular basis. So just because you're only taxing restaurants doesn't mean that you're somehow magically benefiting the poor or hitting the wealthy. But Representative Maestas said the following: unwise as it may have been to exempt some food from the GRT, it's been impossible to build support for taxing it again. And we agree. It's the reform of the gross receipts tax, very broad-based, very thoroughgoing reform that is needed, not what I would call this frozen in amber mentality of this gross receipts tax is what it should be. It's somehow a good tax as it stands, and that it would be better if we just did reinstitute the grocery levy. Maybe you could cut it another 0.5 percentage point due to the unraveling of the swap. But I just don't think politically you're going to get away with imposing a massive new tax on a lot of people when that hasn't been done. And this is something that a lot of Republicans tend to fall into, unfortunately. I mean, you've got the state budget growing 15%. You've got money, more money than they know what to do with. The idea of reimposing the grocery tax just isn't going to fly in the current economic situation. We need to reform the GRT and probably not really consider that reimposing the grocery tax.
Yes, the gross receipts tax, well put. It's not a good tax, and so it needs big reform. It doesn't need just little tweaks around the edges, because what it does to our state is it discourages small business. It discourages doing businesses with service businesses in the state. You get now just over a 7% discount to get your services elsewhere, and in the age of the internet, and Zoom calls and online databases, you can get a lot of services out of state, Paul. And so it's one of those things that it's time to address it. And what do we hear for years when state budgets were tight? Oh, we don't have the money because it's too risky to make any changes to the gross receipts tax because we're up to our bottom dollar with regard to spending. Well, guess what? They've got more money than literally they know what to do with in Santa Fe. And if now's not the time, I'm not sure there ever will be a time for the foreseeable future. But it's good to hear an economist doing it, the LFC economist. I've visited with Representative Maestas many times on economics issues, enough to know that he has an economics degree from the University of Washington, and pretty thoughtful guy when it comes to matters economic. And it's good to see a couple people are at least considering that and talking about it in positive ways. It's something the state really could benefit from for the future.
Yeah, and would love to see Representative Maestas, other Democrats getting more serious with their own plans. Representative Jason Harper had, kind of the not just 1.0, but 2.0 and 3.0 models, pieces of legislation that were introduced a few years ago when there was some broad agreement on the issue of GRT reform. There was also bipartisan support from John Arthur Smith in the Senate Finance Committee. He, of course, was voted out of the legislature in a Democratic primary. And, it would be great to see somebody who is influential with the Democratic caucus in the House kind of leading that and making it a more bipartisan effort. And, of course, needs some of that bipartisanship in the Senate as well. So it's a very important issue, and we're a long way from seriously addressing the problem. But maybe Dan McKay just likes to write good, positive fiction. I don't believe that to be the case, but Dan, certainly his article lends me to believe that there is possibility there where it's been a long time in coming, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, historically, issue of taxation in New Mexico is lined up very much along partisan lines. If you're Republican, you were comfortable and like to cut taxes, all things being equal. If you're a Democrat, you love taxes and like to keep them the same or raise them. I think that's breaking down now with the amount of money we have, the fact that there is a lot of money and people are starting to see. And so let's put that one for me, Paul, in the hopeful category as opposed to just abject despair as it's been in prior years with regard to what might happen at the legislature.
Yeah, and speaking of some of those LFC meetings, in MDOT, the New Mexico Department of Transportation's Joseph De La Rosa recently presented and talked to the Transportation Infrastructure Revenue Subcommittee, saying that essentially the gas tax needs to be addressed in the way that it is levied. Now, I will throw a bone to people who advocate for these taxes. I wish it were a tax that specifically were applied to roads, only roads. I wish we did not have a Davis-Bacon law. But the funding of New Mexico's roads is decreasing over time because the gas tax is at the flat rate, 17 cents, whereas everything we know, especially construction tools and implements, has been going up, up, up. So we could certainly do a lot better job with our transportation dollars than, and I'll talk about the rail runner a little bit later in this podcast, but the 17 cents you pay on the gas tax doesn't go as far as it used to. Now, that is a problem that's been around for many years, and I think there's ways to do transportation smarter than just raising the gas tax. However, the tricky deal is now we have this governor pushing very hard, and to an extent the federal government pushing very hard on electric vehicles, which they don't pay the gas tax at all. And so this is a KRQE July 6th article, electric, newer cars push New Mexico to consider road user fees. And we're not endorsing any particular program at this point, and I haven't even seen the outline of a program in terms of addressing road funding. Certainly, however, the case can be made that the owners of electric vehicles should pay some kind of fee into the road fund to pay for the roads that they drive their electric vehicles on and don't have to pay any taxes to repair and build those roads.
Yeah, and yes, this is as you said, the issue's been happening because of higher miles per gallon just in the gas and diesel fleet, but now with electric not paying it. The other thing about electric vehicles, Paul, is they tend to be quite a bit heavier than gas vehicles, and so their wear and tear in terms of two commodities, tires and roads, tends to be higher than existing gas and diesel vehicles. So yet another reason. And in the short run, there's subsidies, federal and state, for electric vehicles. And then the argument becomes, does it make sense to keep those subsidies and take away the gas tax, or not have them pay a tax for roads? And the answer is maybe in the short run, everything's okay. There aren't that many electric vehicles. But if it goes the way people say it is and the way it's projected to go, we're going to have a lot of issues. And believe me, Paul, do you want to spend 70,000, 75, 80,000 for your electric vehicle and then only be able to drive it on potholed roads? I don't think the answer to that's yes, but
Well,
that's really what it's going to boil down to at the rate we're going.
Well, that certainly does lead to another point, which is that in the current market as it stands, electric vehicles generally are the province of higher income folks. They tend to cost more than traditional vehicles, and they're kind of one of those technologies that tends to be adopted by the early adopters, which disproportionately are people at the high end of the income scale and have more wealth to throw around and are willing to experiment with something. And, getting back to my travel recently, I don't know where all the electric vehicles go when you get, say, to Klein's Corners or Tucumcari, but the number of electric vehicles on the roads declines to some number approximating zero once you get out of major metropolitan areas like Albuquerque, any other big city, Oklahoma City, and so on. So that lends me to believe that either people who drive electric vehicles do not take long road trips, or that they have a spare vehicle sitting around that has a gas-powered engine that they use for those longer road trips. And, it's anybody's guess as to how that market shakes itself out. But I suspect it's a lot of people have the EV for getting around town and not so many of them for those long trips. And that also puts you into a separate economic class by itself, having additional vehicles that you drive occasionally.
Yeah, and Paul, I've read a lot about this, and the articles I've read indicate that the people who have electric vehicles as a second or third family car love them because you can charge them at home, and you have the gas car to go long distances because charging infrastructure is not good. But there's that term home as well. If you have a home and can have a charging unit, the wiring put into your garage, that's one thing. But if you live in an apartment or you live in a area that doesn't have garages, or a small condo or whatever, it's a way different ball game as well. So there's a lot of issues, but I think all of those point to, in the short term and for the foreseeable future, electric vehicles are not the first car to get to work for people who are not quite affluent.
But speaking of electric vehicles, our governor, and see if you remember her state infrastructure advisor, one Martin J. Chavez, former Albuquerque mayor, of course, he and the governor unveiled electric vehicle charging stations in Socorro, noted electric vehicle territory there. Maybe a few professors at New Mexico Tech have electric vehicles. Although, it seems that Socorro residents may not be the primary early adopter set. But, it is an hour away from Albuquerque on the way to Las Cruces and points further south.
And if you have an electric vehicle in Las Cruces and you're driving to Albuquerque, that would be like an oasis in the desert for you to say, at least I'm not going to be stuck in the middle of nowhere. We might need to put a few in truth or consequences for people going the other way as well. So
there you go.
Yeah, there are a lot of issues with regard to the infrastructure to charge these electric vehicles. And how many units are we going to have?
I think just a couple at this point starting out. But the governor and the federal administration, the Biden administration, so they're going to be spending a lot of money here. $10 million in state funds have been allocated through the legislatures last session. $38 million in federal infrastructure. I think that's from the bipartisan infrastructure bill, for a network of electric vehicle charging stations to be located every 50 miles along New Mexico's interstates. So there's a significant investment there. No word as to what folks do if they're traveling on non-interstates, which, of course, Tucumcari and Santa Rosa are lovely. I can attest. I was just there. But
yes, they are.
There are a lot of places worth visiting. Farmington and Durango being in Colorado, but you have to get there off of non-interstate highway. There's a lot of places worth visiting in New Mexico that aren't necessarily along interstates, but look, they've got $48 million in our tax money that they're going to spend on these charging stations. Presumably that's just a down payment. Of course, I would flip it on its head before I hand it over to you, Wally, and say, I'm not a student of history going back 100 years, but I do not recall the federal government involving itself in the funding and the distribution of gasoline stations and filling stations when gas cars really became popular. It seemed to me that the market took up that cause and left it there. So it is, Any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, we've had failures in alternative energy for transportation in my lifetime, Paul. There was once a time when natural gas vehicles were going to be the next best thing to slice bread, because natural gas was cheaper than gasoline and it polluted less. A bit like the arguments that we hear going from coal to natural gas for power generation. The only problem is to get the natural gas compressed to a level that you could put it in a tank and get some mileage out of a car or light truck was hundreds of thousands of dollars for a compressor station. And a compressor station back then, my memory is like $500,000 would buy you 4 pumps that would take somewhere between 4 and 10 times as long to fill an NGV as it would to fill a similar vehicle with gasoline. So we have these issues of number of stations, how much they cost, where they are, and how long does it take for power to be restored to a vehicle, no matter what the type is. And guess what, Paul? Just like electric vehicles we talked, natural gas vehicles are great. They're out there today, but they tend to be used in fleets that travel in a metropolitan area and can fill up at night with low pressure compressors, not these $1 million models. The same thing with electric cars. If you can charge it at home at night and drive it to work and back, life is good. Above and beyond that, things get very complicated.
Yeah. Now, speaking of that road trip I was on, just a little bit for fun, trying to compare real world gas prices, of course, over the span of slightly more than a week. New Mexico, if you are driving eastbound, and we made our way through Tennessee into Ohio, just to give folks an idea of the path we took. If you're in Tucumcari or Santa Rosa, you're paying $4.60 or so cents a gallon. I think it gets down $4.20, $4.30 here. Amarillo, though, you can find gas for very close to exactly $4 a gallon. This is all, of course, information from as recent as possible. Missouri is a very low price gasoline state, Oklahoma as well. So those are kind of your sweet spots if you're following the old Route 66 path. And you get up into Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio, and those states all get back up to the $4.60 range. So I'm sure it has a lot to do with pipelines, different regional policies, et cetera. But, the price differential is significant. And again, you don't see a lot of those electric vehicles on the road. It's something unique to bigger city areas. I was at a museum center, though. Cincinnati has a great museum, children's museum, history museum. They took an old Art Deco train station and just a fantastic. If you're ever in Cincinnati, it's totally worth going to. And a very full, big parking lot. And there were about 8 parking spots, of which one was taken in this sea of full spaces. You know what those spots were? Electric vehicle charging stations.
Yeah, there you go. You know, and it does, that does bring up, you know, this kind of economic efficiency thing that right now we're not there with regard to electric vehicles. It's a little bit like handicap spaces. My personal favorite is the trailheads to some of the toughest hikes in New Mexico. Will have a handicap spot. It's like, you know, like, it's like, you know what? You don't have to, if you're not handicapped, this is still going to be a very hard trail. The other one that almost, I don't know, it's comical, but in a sweet way. I don't mean this harsh, is that if you go to the VA hospital, they have the most handicap spots of anywhere I've ever seen. So they've managed to adapt a little bit. But yes, using, you know, dedicating resources and putting them in places where they're not actually used is just wasteful. And, you know, we're not to the point yet where I think we're even to a scale where we can optimize, but the early view of it is not good. You know, we don't have stations where we need them. And as you point out, I see charging stations at various places around the state and around the country that I doubt if they're, you know, used 5% of the time, just because every time you go by them, they're not used. And this museum complex may be one of those.
Yeah, no doubts. Michelle Lujan Grisham, you know, somebody who obviously we find ourselves at odds with quite frequently, but the media, at least in this case, one media outlet that needs to be acknowledged is Channel 7 KOAT, the local station here. Some folks online on Twitter, including myself, had noted that one of the governor's ads for her campaign involved a woman who had gotten an education to become a nurse, and the governor had her on screen and touted this as a success of her new free college program. Well, that free college program took effect on July 1st. So if you
11 days to today, and when that ad came out was a week ago, so that was a quick student.
I was seeing that ad before July 1st. So the fact is that I think the governor expected everybody to have a time machine or something. The actual reality is that this woman, you know, did get some additional support from the state of New Mexico, but ultimately it wasn't the new free college program, which took effect on July 1st. And that's not what propelled her to become a nurse. The only outlet I've seen take this on and report about it and kind of call BS, for lack of a better word, is Channel 7. So kudos to them for, you know, calling balls and strikes. And I would expect nothing else if they have the chance. You know, Ronchetti says something that's simply counterfactual. But this, you know, when you're the incumbent, you have a lot of benefits to incumbency, including the ability to spread that money around like we have with the oil and gas industry, and she's been able to do that. But, you know, one of those benefits of incumbency also involves being accountable for the policies in a real way, not saying, oh, sometime down the road, this person could benefit, which that would be accurate. Saying that they did benefit from a government program that has not been fully implemented yet is suspect, and I think it would get some level of Pinocchio status if one of the fact checkers chose to actually check facts. But thank you to KOAT Channel 7 for that.
Yeah, and then we have the other even maybe bigger issue that seldom gets talked about is free to who, or I believe the English would be free to whom. Yeah, a shout out to the two Mrs. Obergs that were my English teacher, a mother-in-law and daughter. I think it's whom, but it's like, no, there is no such thing as free college. Somebody has to pay, and so it's never free. You know, it's never free. Someone has to pay, and doesn't mean it's a good idea or a bad idea, but we need to evaluate that because money doesn't grow on trees. Oh, although in Washington it seems to, and what do we have, Paul? What happens when we just print money with reckless abandon? That's one of the things that's impacting our inflation rate.
Yeah. So on that governor's race, the first post-primary fundraising data are out, and Ronchetti outraised Michelle Lujan Grisham $1.2 million to $755,000 in that report. Just further reinforcing, I think, the fact that this is going to be a very hotly contested race for governor. MLG, the incumbent governor, still has vast troves of campaign cash that she can spend and deploy in this campaign. She has a fundraising advantage, but it is interesting that when you get beyond the primary, and I think a lot of Republicans, while they saw Ronchetti as the favorite in the primary, it was a 5-person primary, and there was a lot of angst about who was going to come out of that primary. A lot of Republicans want to keep their powder dry, see who the strongest person is, and then support them. So doesn't really say a lot, except for this is going to be a very, very hotly contested battle for governorship come November. So get ready for lots of campaign ads on both sides.
Yeah, I have a feeling we will all get to see plenty of those. And Paul, I do think this is significant. Just thinking back historically, like when a governor like Bill Richardson would run after his first term for a second, he was one of the ones that could succeed himself. He would always annihilate his competitors in fundraising every time, and so to have even one cycle where a Republican challenger raised more and quite significantly more, I think it is noteworthy, and I do think that it speaks to the competitiveness of this race.
Well, I would go into that whole Bill Richardson thing, but I think it's safe to say that Bill Richardson was much more of a centrist in terms of New Mexico's politics. The Democratic Party was a more centrist party then, so he could be the pro-business guy. Probably not so much on the oil and gas front. A lot of the oil and gas folks just grin and bore it, so to speak. But this governor has embraced a farther left approach, and the Democratic Party has moved farther left along with the New Mexico legislature. And it's going to be, this governor has made her bed on the far left wing of the party. And we're going to see in November whether New Mexico is basically a safe blue state that no matter what you do as governor, you're going to be able to win re-election. This would be, by the way, the first in our current election system
where you can succeed yourself, right?
Where you can succeed yourself for 4 years. This would be, if she were to lose, this would be the first governor in that 2 4-year term scenario that would lose. So it's a very uphill battle still for Ronchetti. I know that it was Bruce King when that system was changed. It was kind of a 2-year re-election system, and getting reelected after just 2 years in office, a whole host of problems. 4 years, New Mexicans have been very willing to send those people back, but nobody has governed, to my knowledge, quite as far out on the left wing of the Democratic Party as this governor. So we are going to find out where it goes.
Yeah. And Paul, I agree with you. The politics was way different back then, but campaign contributions at times tend to be a form of polling as well, where people who put money into campaigns tend to avoid doing that if they don't think a challenger has any chance of winning. And that's certainly not the feeling that I'm getting with the Ronchetti versus MLG case right now.
Yeah, now the Journal did do a story recently, also Dan McKay, rail runner evaluating new schedule. But while they did this report, they also provided an update on the latest ridership information. It's, of course, the first half of 2022 already in the books. And, we always like to see those updates. In fact, we have our own information requests out. according to the Journal article, there was a 104% jump in ridership year over year. That means this particular 6 months saw a tremendous boost in ridership. Of course,
compared to having the train shut down, it's not going to be too hard to do.
It was shut down for early part of 2021, and so ridership of the Rail Runner has been a real issue for a long time, and it's been dropping, generally speaking. Obviously, COVID really dramatically hit the Rail Runner ridership, and it was down to 319,635 at its peak. Rail Runner ridership annually was about 1.2 million folk. So that's, we're talking about a quarter of where it had been back in its heyday. So it's we're a long way from anything really positive in the news. That 1.2 million, basically 2010, 2011, 2012, 1.2 million people or thereabouts took the train. It was shiny and new back in those days, and nobody was working at home, state workers particularly. So they were out riding that train. One notable thing is that, of course, as we discussed a while back on the podcast, the governor, in her infinite wisdom, enacted by herself a 75% reduction in fares through the end of July. $2.50 is now what you can pay for a day pass. Now, the Rail Runner article had a number of interesting facts about scheduling changes that are being considered and other ways that they're trying to entice people back onto the rails. I'm not saying you can't improve things specifically by making maybe a 1 or 2 stop Albuquerque train and an express train to South Capitol and or the government buildings up there. But generally, the train is not an attractive option for people, even with the rising price of gasoline.
Yeah, and the statistic in that article, Paul, it now takes 1 hour and 20 minutes to get from downtown Albuquerque to the South Capitol stop in Santa Fe, which that's a long time, and that does not include your time to get either to the downtown station if you live in Albuquerque, or to walk or take some other transportation to your office. So that is an issue. If that train went 150 miles an hour, I think that the calculus would be a lot different relative to the value it brings. But as it is, it's a bit of a tough sell. And
if you think the Rail Runner is a huge success, you may be alone in that thought. But Bill Sewell's, very liberal, progressive state senator from New Mexico, probably agrees with you. We talked about it at the time. He had introduced legislation in the last session to create high-speed rail throughout New Mexico. He says on Twitter, about within the last 24 hours, I will introduce a bill in the New Mexico legislature, I should say, to fund high-speed rail for the state. Chihuahua to Denver through New Mexico would be economically transformative.
Yes, it would, Paul. Notice he didn't say whether it would be good or bad. If the state of New Mexico pays for our share, it would be disastrous. I'm clear on that, because you need to build fantastically expensive new track. Not that many people want to ride from Chihuahua to Denver, and if they do, guess what? They can still take an airplane. So I don't know. Is that the worst idea I've heard? Maybe this year. It's up there. It's in the top 2 or 3 at a minimum.
Definitely up there. And this is just your friendly reminder that the Rail Runner cost well over $1 billion. It's hard to put a fine point on the construction cost of the Rail Runner because they refinanced it halfway through, but the original estimate was it was approximately 1.2 or so billion dollars. You refinance, you pay for longer term. That, of course, doesn't include all the interest payments. When you talk about how much did your house cost, you don't factor in all the interest payments, even though those are added to the tab for the house. This is just for the physical infrastructure, the train cars, et cetera. We're talking probably on the order of 1.5 just for the actual infrastructure cost of the rail runner at this point. And then it's going to have to be refurbished and new train cars developed. That's just for standard train, and then operating costs 20 to 25 million per year. I can only imagine how much more expensive it would be to do that, to have this system deployed as Sewell's would like.
Yeah, I am with you. It's boggling.
All right. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointinm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.